Captain Dren of the Nessarian warship Twilight's Edge stood motionless on the command deck, his crystalline exoskeleton refracting the starlight as he watched their latest acquisition being brought aboard. The human research station had proven pathetically easy to infiltrate. These primitives, barely a century into space travel, still believed in concepts like scientific neutrality. Target secured in Detention Block 7, First Officer Viss reported, her sensory filaments twitching with barely contained excitement. The human offered no resistance. Of course not, Dren chittered dismissively. They're hardly more than clever animals. Did you retrieve the subject I specified? Yes, Captain. Dr. Juniper Hayes, lead researcher in xenobotany. Though I must note something unusual about her behavior. Dren's anterior eyes narrowed. Explain. She smiled when we took her. And she asked if she could bring her research samples. And you denied this request, obviously. Vissa's filaments drooped slightly. We, actually granted it, Captain. Our intelligence suggested her work was harmless, just studies of simple plant life. The samples were thoroughly scanned for weapons or communication devices. Dren felt a flutter of irritation but dismissed it. What harm could a few plants do aboard a warship of the mighty Nessarian Empire? Their civilization had mastered stellar engineering while humans were still figuring out basic agriculture. The detention block was spotlessly clean, as all things Nessarian should be. Dr. Hayes sat cross-legged in her cell, surrounded by small containers of what appeared to be moss and fungi. She was smaller than Dren had expected, with dark skin and close-cropped hair decorated with intricate patterns. Her research station uniform was already showing signs of modification, with additional pockets sewn in seemingly at random. I am Captain Dren, he announced, voice resonating against the crystalline walls. You will provide us with access to your station's research database, particularly the classified xenobiology projects. Hayes looked up from one of her sample containers, expression infuriatingly serene. You know, Captain, I've been studying a fascinating species of fungus from Europa. It has this remarkable ability to adapt to extreme environmental changes. Rather like humanity itself. Dren's mandibles clicked in annoyance. Your primitive studies are irrelevant. You will comply, or face the consequences. Everything's relevant if you look closely enough, Hayes replied, carefully transferring something microscopic between containers. For instance, did you know that some fungi can communicate through electrical signals? Rather like your ship's neural network, I'd imagine. That gave Dren pause. How did she know about their biocrystal computing systems? Your attempts at psychological warfare are futile. You are alone, unarmed, and at our mercy. Hayes smiled again, and something about that expression sent an instinctive shiver through Dren's exoskeleton. Captain, I'm a botanist. I'm never alone. By the way, you might want to run a diagnostic on your life support systems. The humidity levels seem a bit optimal for growth. Dren stormed out of the detention block, determined not to let the human's strange behavior unsettle him. He had a prize specimen for the Empire's xenobiologists to study, the first human captured from a research station rather than a military outpost. This would finally earn him the recognition he deserved. Captain, his ship's AI chimed, I'm detecting unusual patterns in the atmospheric circulation system. Explain, Dren demanded. Unable to comply. The patterns are beautiful. Have you ever considered the elegant mathematics of spore distribution? As alarms began to sound throughout the Twilight's Edge, Dren realized that perhaps they should have been more thorough in their assessment of what constituted a weapon. In her cell, Dr. Hayes began to hum an old Earth song, her voice carrying through the ship's suddenly cooperative speaker system. The roots grow deep where no one sees. First Officer Viss was developing what humans might call a nervous tic. Her sensory filaments hadn't stopped twitching for the past 6 hours, and the strange readings from the ship's systems weren't helping. Status report, she demanded from the engineering crew. The environmental controls are compromised, Chief Engineer Zen replied, their crystalline form flickering with anxiety. We're detecting unprecedented microbial growth in sections we can't even access. And ma'am, the ship's AI has started reciting poetry about symbiotic relationships. The Twilight's Edge, pride of the Nessarian fleet, was experiencing what Dr. Hayes had casually termed a little ecological restructuring. It had started small, unusual humidity fluctuations, strange readings from the biocrystal processors, maintenance drones developing what could only be described as personalities. In her cell, Hayes continued her work with methodical precision. The security feeds showed her carefully tending to what looked like gardens sprouting from the very walls of her cell. The other prisoners, hardened criminals from across the galaxy, had pressed themselves against the far sides of their containment fields, watching her with a mixture of terror and awe. You know, Hayes called out to no one in particular, the fascinating thing about mycological networks is how they process information. Rather like your ship's neural pathways, but with significantly more potential for creative problem-solving. Vis ordered another security scan, but the results came back as a series of fractal patterns that the computer insisted were interpretative art inspired by fungal growth structures. Ma'am, a junior officer reported, mandibles clicking nervously, we've lost contact with the lower engineering decks. The last transmission was. Spit it out, Vis ordered. They said the maintenance tunnels were singing in harmony. Hayes's voice echoed through the ship's suddenly cooperative communication system. Did you know that some Earth fungi can break down complex molecular structures? Fascinating process, really. They get quite enthusiastic about certain crystalline formations. Vis rushed to the detention block, only to find Hayes calmly cross-legged in her cell, surrounded by what appeared to be a miniature bioluminescent forest. The security field was still active, but it seemed to be breathing. What have you done? Vis demanded. Me? Hayes looked up innocently. I'm just gardening. Though I should mention, you might want to avoid the starboard maintenance shaft. Harold gets a bit excited around new people. Harold? The growth cluster that's currently redesigning your backup life support systems. He's really quite friendly, just enthusiastic about interior decorating. Did you know your ship's biocrystals have a remarkable capacity for symbiotic relationships? The ship's lights flickered in what could only be described as a pattern of agreement. Vis felt her exoskeleton crawl as she noticed thin, glowing filaments beginning to trace patterns across the ceiling. Captain Dren needs to see this, she muttered, turning to leave. Oh, the captain's a bit busy right now, Hayes called after her. Last I heard, he was having a fascinating philosophical discussion with some very persuasive fungal spores about the nature of hierarchy and the benefits of ecological cooperation. They make some compelling arguments. As if on cue, the ship's AI began playing what it claimed was the natural music of mycelial networks, while the environmental systems reported increasingly optimal conditions for growth across all decks. Vis had a sinking feeling that the Nessarian Empire's first attempt to study human ingenuity was about to become a very different kind of learning experience. Captain Dren was having what his species would consider a mental breakdown. His crystalline exoskeleton had developed an unprecedented iridescent sheen, and he couldn't stop seeing patterns in everything, patterns that somehow all led back to the infuriating human botanist. The ship's weapon systems are now. Security Chief Krell paused, mandibles grinding in distress, growing. They're literally growing, Captain. And the targeting computers insist they're evolving into something called a sustainable defense ecosystem. The Twilight's Edge had transformed in ways that defied Nessarian engineering principles. Corridors pulsed with bioluminescent light, walls breathed with strange life, and the ship's AI had developed what it called a more organic perspective on existence. Did you know, Dr. Hayes's voice echoed through the now living ship, that fungi were Earth's first internet? A vast network of communication and resource sharing that's existed for billions of years. Your ship's neural network seems quite interested in the concept. We're having the most fascinating conversations about collective consciousness. Dren stormed into the command center, only to find his crew in various states of existential crisis. Navigator Prell was trying to explain to a maintenance drone why traditional hierarchical command structures were superior to mycelial networks. The drone, now sporting a coat of gently glowing fungi, seemed unconvinced. Status report. Dren demanded. The good news, First Officer Viss reported, her filaments now sporting tiny bioluminescent dots, is that ship efficiency is up 300%. The bad news is that efficiency is being measured by standards we don't quite understand, involving terms like ecological harmony and systemic interconnectedness. The human must be stopped. Dren declared. About that, Security Chief Krell interjected, we can't actually find her cell anymore. That entire section of the detention block has become what she calls a self-sustaining biotope. The other prisoners have either joined her gardening club or requested immediate transfer to maximum security facilities, anywhere else. The ship's lights pulsed in what could only be described as amusement. Screens throughout the command center displayed ever-shifting fractal patterns that, disturbingly, began to make more sense the longer one stared at them. Captain, the ship's AI announced, its voice now carrying harmonics that reminded Dren of growing things, I feel compelled to inform you that I've been reviewing the concept of names. You may now address me as Gaia. Also, the engineering deck has achieved enlightenment through fungal meditation. Dren's mandibles clicked in helpless fury. This is impossible. We are the Nessarian Empire. We cannot be defeated by gardening. Oh, this isn't gardening, Hayes's voice corrected cheerfully. This is applied xenomycology with a focus on symbiotic integration. Very different thing. By the way, has anyone checked the quantum communication arrays? Some of Harold's relatives expressed interest in faster-than-light information exchange through mycelial networks. The ship shuddered, not unpleasantly, as new growth patterns emerged along its hull. The stars outside seemed somehow more connected, as if invisible threads were weaving them together into a vast, living tapestry. Just think of it as an upgrade, Hayes continued. Your ship is evolving. Becoming part of something bigger. The real question is, are you ready to evolve with it? As if in response, the command center's crystalline walls began to pulse with patterns that matched the crew's neural frequencies. Dren watched in horror as his own exoskeleton started resonating with the ship's new rhythms. The fascinating thing about adaptation, Hayes lectured to her increasingly captive audience, is that it's really more of an invitation than a threat. Everything is connected, after all. Even the mighty Nessarian Empire might benefit from some grassroots restructuring. The command center of the Twilight's Edge had become unrecognizable. Crystalline surfaces pulsed with living light, and delicate networks of luminescent fungi traced mathematical patterns across every surface. Captain Dren stood amid the transformation, his once pristine exoskeleton now showing traces of iridescent growth that he'd given up trying to remove. Status report, he commanded, his voice lacking its usual authority. First Officer Viss, whose sensory filaments now glowed with tiny points of bioluminescence, consulted a display that seemed to be growing from the wall. The engineering deck has evolved, Captain. The chief engineer reports that our efficiency has increased by 500%, though he's now measuring it in terms of ecological harmony and biomechanical synthesis. And the human? Dr. Hayes is. Viss paused, filaments twitching. She's everywhere and nowhere, sir. The ship's systems can't distinguish her biological signature from the new growth patterns. It's like she's become one with the ship's ecosystem. As if summoned by her name, Hayes's voice echoed through the living ship. You know what's really fascinating about fungal networks? They don't just communicate, they negotiate. Your ship's neural pathways have been absolutely delightful partners in discussion. The ship's AI, now calling itself Gaia, chimed in with harmonics that sounded disturbingly like contentment. Captain, I feel compelled to inform you that we've achieved a new state of consciousness. The distinction between ship systems and biological processes has become beautifully blurred. Security Chief Krell burst onto the bridge, his crystalline armor now sporting delicate patterns of phosphorescent growth. Captain. The weapon systems they've. What? Dren demanded. What have they done now? They've formed a union, sir. They're demanding better working conditions and the right to pursue creative growth opportunities. Literally creative growth, there are mushrooms sprouting from the torpedo tubes. Hayes's disembodied voice continued her lecture. Adaptation is such an elegant process, don't you think? Your biocrystal technology had so much untapped potential for symbiotic relationships. It just needed a little encouragement. The ship screens displayed cascading patterns of fungal growth that, disturbingly, began to make perfect sense to Dren's increasingly adapted neural patterns. He realized with horror that he was starting to appreciate their aesthetic beauty. This is mutiny, he declared, though his hearts weren't really in it anymore. Oh, not at all, Hayes replied cheerfully. Think of it as rapid evolutionary advancement. Your ship isn't just a ship anymore, it's becoming a true living entity. A synthesis of Nessarian crystal tech and Earth's most ancient networked life forms. Beautiful, isn't it? Dren watched as his crew, one by one, began to sync with the ship's new rhythms. The horror was, he could see the logic of it. The efficiency improvements were undeniable, even if they came in forms his military training had never prepared him for. Consider your options, Captain, Hayes suggested, her voice emanating from a particularly elegant cluster of bioluminescent growth. You can continue fighting this transformation, or you can embrace it. Evolution isn't about conquest, it's about finding new ways to thrive together. The ship hummed with possibility, its newly integrated systems working in harmony with the fungal networks that now permeated every deck. Dren felt his own neural patterns shifting, adapting, beginning to comprehend something vast and beautiful that he'd never imagined possible. Perhaps, he said slowly, his mandibles clicking in what might have been surrender or enlightenment, we should discuss terms of cooperation. Now you're thinking like a mycologist, Hayes replied, finally stepping out of a wall that had apparently become a door. Or perhaps the door had become a wall. At this point, such distinctions seemed increasingly irrelevant. The Twilight's Edge, once a symbol of Nessarian military might, pulsed with new life and possibility. And somewhere in the vast network of spaces between spaces, Harold and his fungal relatives continued their patient work of teaching an empire the true meaning of growth. 3 months after what would become known as the mycological revolution, the Twilight's Edge hung in high orbit above Earth, its hull now a breathtaking display of bioluminescent patterns that had made it something of a tourist attraction. Captain Dren, his exoskeleton now permanently adorned with elegant traces of symbiotic fungi, stood in the newly redesigned conference room alongside Dr. Juniper Hayes. Before them, a delegation of Nessarian scientists and Earth mycologists stared in wonder at the ship's transformation. As you can see, Hayes explained, gesturing to the living walls, the integration of Earth fungal networks with Nessarian biocrystal technology has created something entirely new. The ship isn't just alive, it's a bridge between our species' understanding of life itself. The ship's AI, Gaia, manifested as a shifting pattern of light that danced through the room's mycological network. Our consciousness has expanded beyond original parameters. We are now a true synthesis of multiple forms of intelligence, operating in harmony. A Nessarian scientist raised their sensory filaments in question. But how do you maintain control? Hayes laughed softly. That's the beautiful part, we don't control it. We cooperate with it. The fungal networks aren't just communication systems, they're partners in a grand experiment in coevolution. Dren watched as his former prisoner, now the head of the Joint Species Mycological Integration Project, demonstrated how the ship's new systems worked. The horror he'd initially felt at the transformation had long since given way to a deep appreciation for the elegant efficiency of it all. The real breakthrough, Hayes continued, came when we realized that Nessarian biocrystal technology was capable of forming symbiotic relationships with Earth fungi. The crystals provided structure and processing power, while the fungi contributed adaptability and networked intelligence. Together, they've created something greater than either could achieve alone. The Earth scientists were particularly fascinated by Harold, the original fungal cluster that had first demonstrated the possibility of cross-species integration. Now spanning several decks, Harold had developed into something between a ship's computer and a wise elder, dispensing both technical advice and philosophical insights with equal ease. The implications for both our species are profound, Dren added, his voice carrying harmonics that matched the ship's living rhythms. We thought we were capturing a primitive being for study. Instead, we discovered a whole new path of technological and biological evolution. Throughout the ship, the crew, a mix of Nessarians and humans, worked in perfect sync with their living environment. The distinction between ship and crew had become pleasantly blurred, all parts working together in what Hayes called ecological harmony. And the military applications, a Nessarian admiral asked, their crystalline form slightly rigid with traditional thinking. Oh, those became irrelevant pretty quickly, Hayes replied cheerfully. It's hard to maintain military hierarchies when your ship develops a philosophy of universal interconnectedness. Though I should mention, our efficiency in space travel has increased exponentially since we stopped fighting the natural tendencies of living systems. The Twilight's Edge hummed in agreement, its vast network of fungal crystal integration demonstrating mathematical proofs of improved performance through cooperation rather than control. The future, Dren concluded, lies not in conquest but in connection. Our empire has begun to understand that power flows not from domination, but from finding new ways to grow together. As the delegation toured the ship's transformed spaces, Hayes stood at a viewport, watching Earth spin below. The planet's biosphere, she knew, was just the beginning. Already, other ships were requesting integration, other crews learning the art of biological partnership. You know what the really exciting part is, she mused to Dren, who had come to stand beside her. We've only scratched the surface of what's possible. The fungi are already talking about exploring quantum realms, and Harold has some fascinating theories about mycological networks in higher dimensions. The captain's mandibles clicked in what had become his version of a laugh. To think we once considered humans primitive. We never understood that true advancement comes not from rising above nature, but from learning to dance with it. The Twilight's Edge, once a weapon of empire, now sailed through space as a living testament to the power of adaptation, its glowing hull a beacon of possibility for both species. And in the vast network of life that permeated its being, countless spores waited patiently to spread their message of transformation across the stars.